Okay, so now we're ready to install Django and get our first project set up. But before we can do that, we do need to make sure we have Python installed. So for those of you that don't have Python installed, just go ahead and do a search for Python or go directly to python.org. Click on this website and go through this installation process. So if you go to downloads, select your operating system. In my case, I have Windows. Go ahead and download that installer. Open it up here, and this should just take you through the defaults of getting Python set up on your computer. So I already have it installed. I don't need to do this, but this should walk you through that. Now, the version of Django we are using does require Python 3.6 and up. So if you have an older version of Django, go ahead and run through this process and upgrade it because it needs to be compatible. Otherwise, our Django project will not work here. So once you go through that process, let's go ahead and go back to our desktop and make sure we have Python installed. So in my case, I'm going to open up my Windows command prompt. And if you're completely new to this and you're on Windows, just go ahead to that search bar and just type in COM, and that should autofill and give you this command prompt. So from here, I'm just going to check the version of Python I have and make sure that it was installed. So if I type in Python, it tells me I have Python 3.9.5. So everything checks out. So if you see something like this, it means that you're all set. Python is installed. So I'll clear this, and I'm going to set up my project on my desktop. So we'll just do CD into the desktop here. And now I can install Django because I have Python installed. So to install Django, you can just run pip install Django. And instead of installing it globally, I'm actually not going to execute this command. I'm going to create a virtual environment and download Django into that environment. So for those of you that aren't familiar with what virtual environments are, they're basically just a way of creating different environments for all of our downloads and installs, so that way we don't have any conflicts with our projects. So let me show you an example really quick. So we'll just do pip list here, and this will just show you all the installs that I have globally. So it's not that much here, but we have a few here. And let's say that we have a project on our desktop that works with Django 1.9. And now we want to start a new project that uses Django 3.2. Well, we would have to install the latest version of Django or whatever version that was. And now that 1.9 version will not work because we have a different version of Django. So now we have a compatibility issue, or any other projects that or packages that we have that we don't need are now potentially conflicting with our project because they're all in the same environment, which is globally. So what we do here is we create an environment and we install Django not globally, but into that environment. So if that doesn't make sense, do some research on it, and I'll also try to give you a few examples. So to create our environment, we're going to use something called virtual env. There's a few options with Python to do this. We'll just do pip install, and we'll just do virtual env. So this is just a package that allows us to create our virtual environments. So I already have it installed. Looks like it's all good here. So we'll clear this. And now that we have virtual env, we can create our environment by doing virtual env, and then whatever we want to call our environment. So I can just do cookies or whatever. It doesn't matter. So whatever you want to name it. In my case, I'm just going to call it env. So just short for environment. You can name it whatever you want. Now, this created some folders on my desktop because I ran that command from my desktop. So I'm on a dual screen here, so I'm going to go ahead and drag the files in here. And this is my environment that command just created. So I don't have to worry about all these contents right here. All I have to do is start or activate that environment. So whatever you called it, in my case, I called it env. Make sure you're in the same file path. This is on my desktop. And then just do \scripts and then activate. So this is going to activate my environment here. So we'll just do scripts. I have to do this slow because I keep messing things up. So scripts, and then, activate, that's why. Sorry about that. Okay, so that activates my environment, and I know it's activated because I can see these parentheses right here with the name of the environment. In my case, it's env. So it's activated. Now, if I run pip list here, we're gonna see a list of all the packages I have installed in this environment. So it's going to be less than what's on my global environment right here. So I have pip, setup tools, and wheel. That's kind of like the defaults here. So there's not that much in it. So I can actually deactivate my environment by doing env, scripts, and then I can do deactivate. And now I am working with all the installs in my global environment. So I know it's deactivated because I don't see this anymore right here. So let's just go ahead and reactivate it. So I'll clear it. And for those of you that already know all this. Sorry for the recap. I just want to make sure everyone understands what's going on. So the environment's activated. We ran this command. Now let's go ahead and install Django. So we'll do pip install Django. So one thing I wanted to know is anytime we are working with Django now, and if we did this from the environment, make sure you activate your environment every time you start working on your project. And why this is important is because I see a lot of people work on their project, they'll turn off their computer, they'll restart it, their environment is off when they first turn on their computer, and they can't figure out why they don't have access to these commands. That's because they forgot to activate their environment. So just wanted to make sure you're always doing that. So let's just do pip list again. And there we go. So now we see a few more packages here. We see Django 3.2.4, and that is inside of this environment. So if I cd out of this or turn off that environment, I do not have Django on my global machine here. It's inside of this environment. So sorry for beating that into your brain, but let's just make sure we know that. So now that I have Django installed, let's go ahead and do CLS here. And I just want to go ahead and run through some of the commands that we have access to now. So if we do Django-admin, this is going to give us a list of commands that we have access to now that we have Django installed. And I'm not going to go line by line here. I'm just going to go ahead and cover a few of these. So if you're taking notes, I'm going to cover some main commands here. So we'll just go ahead and go into this one, make migrations. This command right here basically preps our database for migrations. And that's a concept we're going to learn about later. You don't have to worry about what that is. Migrate executes those migrations. So it takes the migrations that we created and it executes those. So basically when we design our database with our classes and models, it creates almost like a blueprint of what that database should look like with make migrations. Migrate actually creates those database tables. Now we also have run server. This turns on our server. And then we also have start project. This is how we create a Django project. And we have start app, which creates apps. And we'll get to that in a second here. So let's go ahead and actually create our first Django project. So we installed Django, we activated our environment, and we can do Django-admin, and we will run that start project command. So we'll do start project, and then whatever we want to call this project. So in this case, I am going to call the project dev search. So you can call it whatever you want. And what this just did is it created our boilerplate files for a Django project. So if I actually drag those in, because that opens that up in my left side right here, or in my other screen here, we see our Django boilerplate files. We see a manage.py file and a few other files here. So we'll get to these in a second. So before we get into those, we can actually run our server here. So I can actually go ahead and cd into that project. So we'll just do dev search. And now we can run Python manage.py run server. So if you run this command, you should see this right here. We should see an alert for unapplied migrations. Don't worry about this. We'll get into it. This tells us, if you're seeing this, that Django is now running on port 8000. So let's go ahead and copy that URL and let's paste that in our browser and see what happens here. So we're going to paste this in. And here we go. We have our server running. This is our Django project. So we do Python manage.py run server. It doesn't do anything, but we can see that everything's working and we have our project set up and ready to go. So to turn that off, we can just do Control-C. That turns off our server, and we can do run server again. And I wanted to show you one quick shortcut. So instead of having to paste in that URL every time, go ahead and add that and then just bookmark it. So that way it's saved inside of your browser. So go ahead and do, where is this? We can do bookmarks here, add to bookmark, or bookmark this tab here. So we'll save it. In my case, I already have it. So when I open up a new tab, all I have to do is click port 8000, and there we go. Our project is active and ready to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and just close this out right now, and I wanna take care of a few other things here. So if you're continuing to work on or work from your command prompt here, your Windows command prompt, continue to do that. I know I'm really zoomed in, so it kind of looks funny, but I'm actually gonna close this out, and I wanna configure my virtual environment and open up my text editor before we go into the files here. So what I do here is I take this virtual environment and I like to drag it into my Django folder. So that way I know exactly where it's at and there is no issues with losing it or anything like that. So I know exactly how to activate it. Now I'm gonna open up VS Code here and I'm gonna open up that Django project. So if we go ahead and go to desktop or wherever you have your project, open up the new Django projects here. So if you're using Sublime Text, Atom, all those are good editors. In this case, VS Code actually gives me a command prompt, so I can execute these from here. And by default, my virtual environment is on. If it's not, go ahead and just do env scripts activate, and you should be good. So here are my project files. We have a manage.py file. You saw me run python manage.py. This basically helps us execute those Django commands. You never want to touch this file. Unless you know exactly what you're doing, don't touch it. I've never had to modify this file. If you do, you're probably going to break something. So I just want to make that a clear warning, don't touch this file. If we look here, SQLite, that's basically an SQLite database. Once we actually run those migrations that I talked about, this is where our data will be stored until we change up our database. Long term, we will be using Postgres, but for now, Django just gives us something to work with and test with. env, that's our environment. We drag that in here. So dev search. So the first file I want to go over is going to be settings.py. So instead of going line by line here, I'll just summarize it, and then we will actually go through certain parts of it as we build out the project. Now this file is basically the main project configuration for your entire Django project. This is where we configure any apps that we add in, our middleware. This is how we configure our templates, set up our database. This is that connection. So when we modify it, is basically like the command center to your project and how your project knows how to work, what to include, and so on. So settings.py, we're going to be in here quite a bit. Now, if we go to URLs here, I'm actually going to take out these comments here. Our urls.py file is basically the URL navigation for our entire application. Let me just run this install really quick here. So this is basically how we determine what route users go to. So this is a list right here. Let me fix the spacing here. If you notice, URLs pattern right here, or URL patterns, is actually a list. So later on, when we have projects, we'll set up routes like that. When we have profiles, this is where we configure how a user navigates the website and what happens when they go to these routes. So later on, these will be functions that get executed. So urls.py, it's a very important file. It takes care of all the navigation for the site. For now, we only have this route, which is not going to work at this point until we do something else. Now, WSGI, we're not going to worry about this. This stands for Web Server Gateway Interface. This is that server for Django. And then we also have ASGI, which is Asynchronous Server Gateway Interface. This is just another option. Django does give async support now from like 3.1, I believe. We don't have to worry about this, and then just the init file. And that's really it. So settings and URLs are going to be the two main files that we work with, and we'll just address them one by one as we face them. Now, the next thing I want to do in this video is actually create our first app. And this is going to be a weird concept to explain. So let me open up a diagram that I have drawn up here. So Django, in this case, we have dev search. That's our project file. That's like the website. Now, the actual functionality in the websites or in our website sits inside of apps. Now, in theory, this folder right here is basically the configuration. That's our settings, our URLs, and our server. But the actual models, templates, URLs, and API, and where all that's going to sit is going to be inside something called an app. Now, typically, a project is made up of multiple apps. Again, we don't need multiple apps, but it's the best way to do things. So just to try to explain what's going on here, in this case, Facebook.com is a project. And let's say we want to build out our user portion. This is where users can log in. We store user data, anything that's surrounding users. We want to create its own app called users. So the user app will take care of all the database tables for a user, URL routing, templates, and I just summarized it as in contains all database tables, URL routings, and business logic for user accounts. Now, Facebook Marketplace, if you're familiar with that, Facebook has an option to buy, sell products in your local city or whatever. You can actually, almost like a Craigslist version of that. Facebook would take this project, and this is a Facebook used Django, and they would probably separate Marketplace into its own app. So anything to do with sales, transactions, products would be separated into its own app. Then we have groups. This is like Facebook groups. Facebook would typically put that into a groups app. So that way, all these files are completely separated. Again, you don't have to do it, but it keeps our code clean because once your project gets to a certain size, this can get really messy. So we separate everything into apps. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, we'll start seeing what's going on here. So in this case, remember, we need at least one app in here. So inside of our Django folder, I'm going to open up that terminal here. Let's close these out. Let's go ahead from our dev search folder. So we have to run this command from this folder. We're going to run python manage.py start app. What's our first app going to be? So in this case, this is where we are going to store user projects. So we're going to start that portion because later on we're going to have a users app and a projects app. So this website is going to have two apps here. Let's go ahead and create our projects app and we'll go over some of those files. So now we see a folder called projects. So if I open it up from here, just to give you 2 points of views here, we see projects in here. If we open that up, we see some files in here. So if I open up the projects app, we see models. This is where we will create our database tables. We see views. This is where the business logic will be taken care of for the functions that get triggered when the URLs are activated. And then we have a few other ones that help us configure our admin panel and the main apps configuration. So we don't have to worry about these right now and migrations and so on. We'll get to these as we go ahead and actually start building this out. So the last thing I'm going to do here is go to my settings.py file, and I am going to register this app that we created with our project, because at this point, this project has no idea this app exists, even though the folder is inside of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in here and we're going to tell it that we added a new app. So we'll just do projects.apps. So we're going into the projects folder, into the apps folder, apps.py, and we're going to tell it to go into this class right here and tie into this class so it configures it. So we're going to do projects.apps.projects.config. So now this Django project right here knows about that app and everything is ready to be applied here. So in the next video, what we're going to do is actually start connecting our URLs, and we will return a couple of calls from those URLs so we can actually see how to navigate a website with that server on.